Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we will discuss a short story by V.S. Pratchett. The name of story is Blind Love. V.S. Pratchett, as far as the writer is concerned, he was born in 1900 and he died in 1997, just 23 years ago. He spent a long life of 97 years. And as far as his achievements are concerned, he won many prizes uh, of different categories. He was also appointed as in information ministry, and he uh, wrote many essays and also delivered lecture in top class universities of the world. So he was a well-known literary figure of his time. And as far as his literary activities are concerned, he is known for his short stories, and he also wrote five novels. So this is a short biography of V.S. Pratchett. He was British. So let's start with its story. This story, we have uh, mainly four to five characters: Mr. Armitage, Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, and Marge or Mag. This story is about love, lovemaking, some complexes, some religious factors, complaints to God Almighty, and some doubts, suspects, suspicions, and all that. Mr. Armitage, he was a renowned lawyer uh, living in a big villa near London and having lot of money. He was a wealthy man, but he was completely blind. You know, in blind categories, sometimes you see there is blind cricket World Cup and blind cricket teams. So most of them, their players 20% their eyesight is visible, for some 40% is visible, for some 10% is visible, but this person is completely blind. But he is working as a lawyer, a senior lawyer, and he had many secretaries, uh, those who came and who left because of his strange habits, and also because it's very difficult to survive with an employer who is completely blind and who is a lawyer. So they left, many of the secretaries, the female secretaries, they joined and they left. Mrs. Johnson, she also joined Armitage as secretary to him, as her personal secretary. So her duty was uh, to do everything for Mr. Armitage, like reading newspapers for him, reading court cases for him. When he's dictating, she used to write. So she was there to guide him. Actually, she was his eyes. So Mrs. Johnson, she was a divorced woman of 39 years age. Now, why was she divorced? Because she loved a person, and both of them, they thought that they should marry. When they were about to marry, just one day before their marriage, uh, they they were, just very close to each other in a single room, and they wanted to have some love making with each other. And when he tried to take off her clothes, she, just pulled her back, and she said that it's not good to do anything because only one day is left in our marriage, so let's wait for tomorrow. When the marriage was done, they went to a hotel for their honeymoon or wedding night. Now, what happened? There was a spot around the neck of this girl, this lady, Mrs. Johnson. She always covered her body, and when her husband, no, he was his husband at that time. Before that, he said that this spot, it looks very attractive and very beautiful, just like a mole it was. And when the marriage was done, they went to the hotel, and these things are mentioned there in the story. Actually, I let you know one thing, that this story is more than romantic. Once we call a romantic story, but this is something more than romantic. Everything is minute details between man and woman, husband and wife, when both of them they are together in a single room. Each and everything is mentioned there. So I would skip many things, but I'll try to explain the rest of the things. So when both of them they were together, it was their first night of marriage. And what happened, that both of them they came closer to each other. But what happened, uh, there was, as I'm telling you, that there was a spot or a dot or a smudge on her neck. It was not only one dot or smudge. Actually, that there was a kind of, like, once you see that if you are having, we see many kids and many men, those some they say that boiled water or hot oil is poured on their skin, and the skin is burned. It leaves its impact forever, effect on, and it is visible all the time that there was something. So in the same way, on her body, uh, around her breast and around her back, there was completely, not only dots, but like the body, just like it was burned. Not it was burned, but there were, uh, you know like the spots were there, that something, the body was completely damaged. So that is why she tried to hide her body every time. So when her husband, on the first night, he saw it, he became very angry, and he said that, how dare you to hide it from me, that your body is so ugly, like it was all spotted from the neck down to the, it goes to the belly and all around. So it was very a kind of shame for her. She always tried to hide it, but she was in love with that person. So she said that whatever has happened, it's not my fault, it happened, just because the will of God. But he said that, as you have deceived me and cheated me, so our marriage will not continue. She tries to convince him, and now he again says that, yesterday when I was trying to do something with you, that is why you wanted to hide it, that is why you didn't pull off your clothes. Now she was trying to explain, but everything was done. He was very angry. He said that, I just feel disgust standing with you, and your body is so ugly, so I'm leaving. So he left, and both of them they were divorced on the first night. So this was the complex with this Mrs. Johnson, that her body was not, she was not having a beautiful body that may be liked by men, although she had many affairs. But this was the reason, because she was divorced just because of this, the spots on her body. So it left its stronger impact in her mind. She was always depressed whenever she thought about it. So this was the reason she was divorced. But Mr. When she is working here, uh, her divorce and everything, it is past. The incident that I have described within the story, she remembers it once. So this is why she was divorced. Mr. Armitage, when she started working there, Mr. Armitage has a close friend named Mr. Smith. So most of the times he goes there. And Mrs. Johnson also, he was having a Rolls Royce car, a big car. He was a wealthy man, as I have already told you. So both of them they frequently visited Mr. Smith's house, and Mr. Smith was a poor man. He was under heavy debts, and he was also from London. This area where story is taking place, it is close to London, the city. I mean, the nearby, a town nearby by London. So in the beginning of the story, they go there, and Mrs. Johnson, she doesn't like Mr. Smith, but she doesn't say anything. They have some conversations, then they come back. Now, what happens? She reads every day, she reads newspapers for him, she writes cases for him, court cases, everything. And almost 3 years have been passed. She is working there. And what happens one day? She was fond of playing tennis. Once, what happened? She went to play tennis with her friend that I have mentioned here, the name Marge or Marg. She was her close friend. Both of them, they discussed just like the women, they were discussing about Mr. Armitage. Mr. Armitage was married, but when he was blind about 20 years ago, his wife left him. Now, both of them, they are having the same fate. Mrs. Johnson was divorced by her husband because of having ugly body, having, some spots, some dirty spots on her body. And Mr. Armitage, he was divorced. His wife left him because he was blind. Before that, they were spending good life, but as he became blind, uh, his wife left. Now, this Miss Marg and Mrs. Johnson, while playing tennis, they are discussing that why his wife left him. So both of them, they agree that it's really very difficult to survive with the man who is completely blind. So it might be possible that his wife couldn't feel comfortable with him, so she left. But Mrs. Johnson says that it's not one of the big reasons that a man who is suddenly having some accidentally he become blind or he become crippled. So women, they should not. So this was the discussion uh, she is having with Miss Mag. Now, what happens one day? This Mr. Armitage, he was moving in the lawn, and Mrs. Johnson, she was looking at him from the window. While walking, there was a pool or a pond, a swimming pool in the house. He was going there, just he was walking, as he is blind, so he slipped and fell into the pool. It was winter season. uh, he was completely wet, and all the servants, he was having cook, he was having gardener, they ran, and she was looking, Mrs. Johnson was looking at him. She also ran towards him. When he came inside house from the pool, he was very angry. And when he went to his room, he was just turning or taking off all his clothes. Mrs. Johnson was also there. She was trying to help him to get things or to get new clothes, and she said that you must change your clothes right now, otherwise you may get pneumonia. He was very angry, and he said that just go out of the room, get out of the room. She felt insulted, humiliated. She went to her room because she was living in the same house, in the house of Mr. Armitage. She went to her room, and she thought that probably she had broken the rule. So the rule was not to cross the limits because it was his complete privacy. He was standing there. He was, without clothes. He was in his room. Whatever the case was, she must not have interfered. She is thinking in herself that I have humiliated him. Now, after some time, he comes to Mrs. Johnson's room, and he says that I want to say sorry because I said you get out of the room. Now, she says that do not be worried about it, because she says that she can understand what humiliation and insult is, and you might have felt insulted because I was there, and I believe that I mustn't have been there. So I feel sorry for that. Now, Mrs. Johnson says that she is feeling sorry for being there, but they talk to each other. Both of them, they again, went back to their room, to the room of Mr. Armitage, and there they had uh, Mr. Armitage. He started, touching his hands. She tries to, uh, go. She tries to stop him, but she couldn't stop herself. At the moment, she was thinking about the spots on her body, that when I take off my clothes, he might see my body and he would feel. that I'm ugly, as my previous husband has left me because of that. These complexes were in her mind. But at the same time, she was thinking that he's completely blind. So she tried to, first, she was having a kind of war in her mind that she should allow him to do something or not. But she couldn't stop herself, like she couldn't stop him, and she was there, and both of them, they were together and in love making and all that. So all the details of the room and what happened, all that, that is mentioned in the story. When you read it, you can come, I mean, they are very minute details they are mentioned, so I'm skipping it actually. It's better for you to read by your own, those incidents, those lovemaking scenes. So she goes, again, the next day, both of them, they are working normally. And the next day she says that previous night we had a mistake, we must not commit that mistake again. And a typical women nature. But now she was again, and he again said that whatever is happening, it must continue. No, both of them, they have become partners, like girlfriend boyfriend, but they were not married yet. Now what happened, that these scenes were going on, and Mrs. Johnson, she frequently visited church also. She visited church not because she was a religious woman, but she wanted to go to church because sometimes we go to worship places because if we do not go, people would say that why are they not going to their worship places. So she goes to the church every Sunday. uh, Now, this Mr. Armitage, one day, he said that when you go to church, people might look at you or they might observe you. No, he was showing his possessiveness, like he was having some doubts about the character of Mrs. Johnson. She tried to explain, and then she said that I cannot live with a person who is so doubtful like you about my character and things. Like you are getting more possessive and getting more psychopath. So she left the room and goes into her room, and she says that I will find another job, that she would not stay there and she would find another job. But Mr. Armitage, he comes again to her room and he says that you must not go to any other place, because in doing so you will destroy yourself getting a new job, getting adjusted somewhere, the facilities and the salary that you are getting here, and your relationship with me, then it would be quite difficult. But the next day, as he had told these things to her, she was convinced again. She said it's all right. But one day, what happened when she came back from the church? He said that, now you have come back from the church, and now you do one thing. She asked, what? And he said that spit on your hands. First, she hesitated, then he spitted, and then he said that mix it with some soil and then put it on my eyeballs. This was She was quite embarrassed while doing it. She said that why are you seeing me, because your eyes may get hurt with it. He said no, God, like he's talking about Jesus Christ, Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. He says that he was blessed with the quality to make the dead people alive, and to make he was having the miraculous quality to make to give eyesight to blind people, and he used to do the same. So if you do the same, then I will get my eyesight back. Now this thing, activity, make Mrs. Johnson more curious about him, and more, she thought that probably she had chosen a wrong person for that, because every time he's showing so much possessiveness and he's behaving in such awkward ways. Then he says that he's complaining to God that why God has made him blind, and she says that God has his own ways to do things. But this was their discussion about religion. She was quite upset with his this aspect of personality. And after that, again, she did not leave the house. Both of them, they were living together. One day what happened that Mr. Smith was he was in London. Mr. Armitage in his Rolls Royce car, he went to London, and she, Mrs. Johnson, was alone there in the house. She went to the pool, and she, took a bath there in the pool, and she was taking a sun bath, because in normal routine she never go to the pool, or she never had swim there, because whenever to take a sun bath she had to take off her clothes. But while taking off her clothes, someone might see her that her body is quite ugly, so she tried to hide. So she was alone in the house, and all the other servants, they were on leave, so she thought that she should enjoy a uh, swim in the pool. In the meantime, when she was there, uh, she suddenly saw that when she was taking, covering herself with a towel, she saw that Mr. Smith was there. Now she was thinking that probably he had seen her, but actually Mr. Smith had not seen her exactly. He doesn't mention it. He says that I came here to meet Mr. Armitage. She says that she had gone to London. Sorry, he had gone to London, and Mr. Smith had few words with her, just casual, conversation, and then he goes back. Now she was thinking over and over again that probably he had seen my body, and probably he would tell him, Mr. Armitage. But again, she just, in these thinkings, uh, she stops herself to explain everything to others. She thought that she was in doubt that Mr. Smith has seen her or not. So she leaves this topic in her mind. Then Mr. Armitage comes back. He talks about, and she says that Mr. Smith was here. So he says that I'm getting a kind of cure from Mr. Smith, and some, like supernatural powers and some religious activities. He would give me my eyesight back. In this way, he says that you should give a check of 200 or 300 pounds to Mr. Smith. And she tries to tell him that it is a wastage of money, it's a big amount, and you should not waste it. But he says that it's all right. Now both of them, they again go to Mr. Smith's house, where Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Johnson, they had discussion over many things. And Mrs. Smith, she talks about Mr. Smith and her problem and his problems. Mrs. Johnson also speaks. Both of them, this Mr. Armitage and Mr. Smith, they were having a lot of discussion in single room, separate room. And then they come back again to their villa, and after that they were shifted to another place, and they started living there. So this was all about the story. Now, as far as its themes, or some not exactly themes, but the points of discussion in the story are, first of all, its authority of God, because they have discussion about religion in the story. That this Mr. Armitage, he's complaining to God that why he has made me blind, why God has made him blind. And this Mrs. Johnson, she says that everything is the will of God. So, although Mrs. Johnson is not a religious woman, as I have already told you, but she was somehow, she thought that everything that happens, it happens by the will of God. And she, because she was herself having complexes of her ugly body, because this Mr. Armitage had never seen her body, he was completely blind. So she feels it more comfortable that he would never be able to see him. And once Mr. Armitage, he says that somebody is curing me, like Mr. Smith is curing me, and I will get that he would get his eyesight back. This Mrs. Johnson, she becomes worried that if he gets his eyesight back, then he would probably see me, see my body, and again there will be problems. But she knows that getting eyesight back is a long process, or it may happen or may not happen. So there is authority of God, religious activity, that there are people who complains to God Almighty, and there are people who submits everything to give submission to God Almighty. Then complexes, both of them, they are complexed, having some personality problems, like a person who is crippled, like somebody who is not having a, like crippled person who's not having hands and foot, or sometimes they are blind, or sometimes they are dumb. So once you have a weakness in your body, it makes you psychologically complexed person. As and specifically for a woman, it becomes it is, quite embarrassing for a woman and quite disturbing for a woman when she's been rejected just because of her body or for her appearance is not very good. It is natural. So both of them, they had complexes. He was having complexes of blindness, and she was having complexes of her body and the spots on her body, because of that she was divorced. And then revenge. Revenge is mentioned here when she was first going to have love making with Mr. Armitage in his room. She thought that probably she is taking revenge from her previous husband because he left her, but no, she is having again the same pleasures of life with another person. But after that, it was not a revenge. She thought that it was her own pleasure. So this was, in a kind of revenge, she developed a relationship with Mr. Armitage. In the beginning, when he was close to her, at first time, she thought she was taking revenge from her previous husband, in her mind. But after that, it became pleasure for her, and both of them, they continued their relationship. And love, exactly, love is the theme, because both of them, they were lovers after having so much discussions about religion. He was skeptical about her character, that she's going to church, somebody would see her, she's having, he's showing possessiveness, over possessiveness about her. But still both of them, they prefer to love each other. So they were made for each other, because both of them, they were not acceptable for normal people. He was left with by his wife, she was left by her husband. He was left because he was blind, and she was left because she was having an ugly body, or some spots on her body. So both of them, they love over possessiveness. This is the nature of Mr. Armitage, because he frequently, when he asks too many questions from her, that when she married, how many relationships she was having, how many boyfriends she was having, and how many times she was having very close relationship and all that. And these things made Mrs. Johnson quite upset. Whenever he asked such questions, she openly says to him that you are actually, she says to Mr. Armitage, that he was crossing his limits, and he was actually making her embarrassed and upset. So he was showing over possessiveness. And complaints, that I already told you, that few people, they have complaints to God Almighty and to the society, and few people, they adjust themselves whatever happens to them. So both of them, they were rejected due to their appearance, that whatever has happened. And both of them, they were fit for each other, because he cannot see her body, and she was also happy that he can never see her body. So this was all about the story.